California's golden hills and sprawling cities are famous for their beauty, but beneath the surface lies a darker side, a shadowy world of cursed towns, haunted landmarks, and chilling tales that defy explanation. It's a state where whispers echo beneath forgotten bridges, where shadowy figures roam desolate trails, and where the past refuses to stay buried. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses until I experienced them for myself. From an abandoned cell in Alcatraz to a bridge that speaks your name, each place left me shaken, questioning what I thought I knew about the world. These aren't just stories, they're warnings, because some places don't let you leave without taking a piece of you with them. Now, let me take you on a journey through California's most terrifying haunted places. But be warned, by the end, you might never look at these locations, or your own safety, the same way again. Story 1. The Whispering Bridge. The first time I heard my name whispered on the wind, I was alone beneath the creaking beams of a forgotten bridge. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. It was the kind of place people avoided. But that night, curiosity got the better of me. It all started as a dare. My friends and I were hanging out in a small town just outside Los Angeles. You know the type. One gas station, one diner, and stories that everyone seemed to know but no one wanted to talk about. Someone mentioned the old bridge on the edge of town. They said it was haunted by the souls of those who had jumped, or worse, been thrown from its rotting planks. People hear things, my friend Eric said, his voice low and dramatic. Voices, whispers, sometimes even screams. I laughed it off at first. Ghost stories were great for scaring kids, but I wasn't a kid anymore. Still, as the group started piling on the dare, my pride kicked in. "Fine," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "I'll go." The journey to the bridge. The walk to the bridge was eerie in itself. The town's streetlights faded behind me, leaving nothing but the pale glow of the moon and the crunch of gravel under my feet. The air grew colder as I neared the forested edge of town, and soon the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The bridge came into view, and I stopped. It was just as creepy as Eric had described. The wooden planks were weathered and cracked, some barely clinging to the rusted metal frame. Below it, a shallow creek reflected the moonlight like shards of broken glass. There was a plaque near the edge, barely readable through years of grime. "In memory of those we lost." I hesitated, but only for a moment. I wasn't about to let some old ghost story scare me off. I stepped onto the bridge, the wood groaning under my weight. The first signs. At first, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears, making every small sound seem amplified. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight over the wooden beams. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the hairs on my arms stood up despite my jacket. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. I froze, holding my breath. It could have been the wind, but it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded human. "Hello," I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper itself. Silence. I took another step, and the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was soft, almost playful, like someone was teasing me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight behind me. Nothing. Just the empty bridge and the dark forest beyond. The whispers grow. As I moved further onto the bridge, the whispers became more frequent. They seemed to come from all around me, carried on the breeze. Sometimes they were faint, like a single voice calling from far away. Other times they overlapped, like a dozen people whispering all at once. And then I heard it, my name. It was unmistakable. Someone or something whispered my name so clearly that I instinctively turned around. My flashlight beam swept across the bridge, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then from somewhere beneath the bridge, I heard a soft, wet plop, like something had fallen into the creek. What was beneath the bridge? I leaned over the side of the railing, shining my flashlight into the shallow water below. The creek was calm, its surface undisturbed. But just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A ripple. Something moved beneath the water. It was quick, barely visible, but enough to make my heart pound. The whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't teasing anymore. They were angry. "Leave," one voice hissed, so close it felt like someone was speaking directly into my ear. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The bridge groaned under my sudden movement, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might collapse. The climax, I started walking back toward the edge of the bridge, my steps quick and uneven. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger and pain. And then the laughter started. It was faint at first, almost childlike, but it quickly turned into something else. Something wrong. It was high-pitched and distorted, echoing through the night like a warped recording. Suddenly the flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my hand, but it wouldn't turn back on. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from the other side of the bridge. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, and then I saw it. At the far end of the bridge, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed. The escape. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran. The whispers, the laughter, the footsteps, they all chased me, growing louder with every step I took. The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. When I finally reached solid ground, I didn't stop. I ran all the way back to town, my lungs burning and my heart racing. I didn't tell my friends what happened that night. I didn't want to admit that I had been scared, that maybe there was some truth to the stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me. Even now, when I'm alone at night, I sometimes hear it, a faint whisper, calling my name. And every time I wonder if it's still waiting for me beneath that bridge. Story 2. The Ghost of Alcatraz. I didn't believe in ghosts until I spent the night in Alcatraz's cell block D. They called it the Hole for a reason, and by the time the tour ended, I understood why no one ever wanted to be left there alone. It started as an innocent idea, a way to make history come alive. I'd always been fascinated by Alcatraz, the infamous prison perched on a rocky island in the San Francisco Bay. The stories of escapes, riots, and the ruthless isolation of the inmates intrigued me. When I found out about an exclusive overnight tour, I couldn't resist. "Just don't stay in cell block D too long," the guide warned as we stepped off the ferry. Even the guards hated going down there. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a tourist gimmick. Little did I know those words would haunt me long after I left the island. First steps into Alcatraz. The tour began like any other, our guide leading us through dimly lit corridors while recounting tales of infamous inmates and attempted escapes. The air was heavy with history, the cold stone walls seeming to absorb every scream, every plea for freedom. We explored the cell blocks, the mess hall, and the warden's quarters. Every room felt steeped in tension, as if the energy of those who'd suffered here still lingered. But it wasn't until we reached cell block D that I felt the first pang of unease. Unlike the other blocks, cell block D was darker, colder. The cells here weren't just small, they were claustrophobic with heavy steel doors that slammed shut with a deafening finality. These were the solitary confinement cells, reserved for the most dangerous or disobedient inmates. They called this the Hole, the guide said, his voice echoing eerily in the narrow corridor. No light, no sound, and no escape. As he spoke, I glanced into one of the cells. It was pitch black inside, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. A shiver ran down my spine. The dare. When the tour group moved on, a fellow participant named Alex nudged me with his elbow. "Hey," he whispered, grinning, "let's stay behind for a bit, see if the ghosts are real." I hesitated. The guide had warned us not to linger in cell block D, but I didn't want to look like a coward. "Fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just for a few minutes." The rest of the group disappeared around a corner, leaving us alone in the oppressive silence of the block. The first encounter. At first, nothing happened. We walked slowly down the corridor, our footsteps echoing off the walls. The cells were empty, their shadows stretching long and dark in the dim light. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from one of the cells. "You hear that?" Alex asked, his voice low. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. We approached the cell where the tapping seemed to come from. Alex shined his flashlight inside, but there was nothing there, just an empty cot and a rusted toilet. "See?" I said, forcing a laugh. "Nothing to—" Before I could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. We spun around, but the corridor was empty. Alone in the dark, Alex suggested we each go into one of the cells, just to see what it felt like. "You first," he said, smirking. With a roll of my eyes, I stepped into one of the cells. The air was colder inside, the silence almost deafening. Alex closed the door behind me, and for a moment, I felt the overwhelming weight of isolation. "Not so bad," I said, trying to keep my voice light. But then the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and a faint smell of decay filled the air. I heard whispers, soft at first, but growing louder. "Alex, open the door," I said, panic creeping into my voice. He laughed. "What's wrong? Scared already?" "I'm serious," I snapped. "Open it." As he fumbled with the door, I felt something brush against my shoulder. My heart raced as I spun around, but there was no one there. Finally, the door creaked open, and I stumbled out, my breath coming in gasps. The shadow figure. We decided to leave, but as we turned to go, Alex stopped suddenly. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing down the corridor. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, in the dim light, a shadow moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The shadow grew darker, more defined, until it took the shape of a man. He stood motionless at the far end of the block, staring at us with empty, hollow eyes. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Alex's arm, but as we turned to leave, the figure took a step forward. Trapped. We bolted toward the exit, but the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how far we ran, the door stayed out of reach. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. When we finally reached the exit, the door was locked. Alex pounded on it, shouting for help, but no one came. I turned back to the corridor and my blood ran cold. The shadow figure was closer now, its eyes fixed on me. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. Escape. The door finally creaked open, and we stumbled out into the cold night air. The rest of the group was waiting near the ferry, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. "Where were you?" the guide asked. "We've been looking for you for over an hour." Alex and I exchanged a glance. We hadn't been in cell block D for more than 15 minutes, or so we thought. The aftermath. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow figure, its hollow eyes staring into mine. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail. It was a photograph taken during the tour, a group shot in front of the prison. In the back of the photo, barely visible, was the shadowy outline of a man standing in the doorway of cell block D. Story 3, The Screaming Hotel Room. The manager warned me not to stay in room 312, but cheap rooms in San Francisco don't come often. It was a last-minute trip, the kind where you're desperate for any available room that doesn't cost a fortune. After calling around, I found a dingy little hotel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, a faded sign, cracked windows, and the faint smell of mildew in the lobby, but I didn't care. When I checked in, the manager slid the key across the counter without making eye contact. "You'll be in room 307, he said, his voice gruff. "And whatever you do, don't go near room 312. I frowned. "Why not?" "It's out of order," he muttered, already turning away. The way he said it, though, didn't sit right with me. Out of order? That didn't explain the way his hands trembled or why his eyes darted nervously toward the hallway. But I didn't push it. I grabbed my key and headed upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of dim that makes shadows stretch longer than they should. My room was near the end of the hall, just a few doors down from room 312. As I passed it, I felt a sudden chill. The air was colder here, the smell sharper, like damp earth. The door to 312 was taped off with peeling strips of "Do Not Enter" tape. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Shrugging off the unease, I entered my room, locked the door, and threw my bag on the bed. The room was as basic as I'd expected: a squeaky mattress, a tiny TV, and a flickering overhead light. I settled in, trying to ignore the faint hum of unease that had followed me upstairs. It was just after midnight when I heard the knock. It was faint at first, like someone lightly tapping on the wall. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time louder. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from room 312. I told myself it was nothing, probably just old pipes or the building settling. But then came the scream. It was sharp and guttural, the kind of sound that cuts straight through you. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. The scream came again, louder this time, followed by a series of muffled thuds. It sounded like someone was trapped inside the room, banging on the walls for help. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. "There's someone in room 312, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think they need help." The manager's response sent a chill down my spine. "Don't open the door," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay in your room. Whatever you hear, don't open the door." I barely slept that night. The screaming eventually stopped, but the tension in the air didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something watching me from the shadows. When morning came, I headed to the lobby, determined to get some answers. The manager was there, his face pale and drawn. "What's going on in room 312? I demanded. "I heard screaming." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "That room is cursed," he said finally. "A woman died there years ago, murdered by her husband. Guests who stay in that room, they hear her. Sometimes they see her." "Why not just close it off?" I asked. "We did," he said. "But no matter what we do, the activity doesn't stop." I wanted to push further, but he shook his head. "Just stay away from it," he said. That night, I couldn't shake my curiosity. What could be so terrible about that room? Ghosts didn't exist, or at least that's what I'd always told myself. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The air was cold again, the silence oppressive. I stopped in front of room 312, staring at the peeling tape on the door. My hand hovered over the knob, and then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from inside the room. "Help me," it said. My stomach turned, but I couldn't move. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." Against every instinct, I reached for the knob. The door creaked open, revealing darkness so thick it felt alive. I shone my flashlight inside, and the beam barely penetrated the shadows. The room was freezing, the air heavy with the smell of rot. The furniture was overturned, the walls covered in deep scratches. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back to me. Her hair was long and matted, her clothes torn and blood-stained. She was trembling, her shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Are you okay?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes hollow and black as voids. She opened her mouth, and the scream erupted. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room and shaking the walls. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into total darkness. I fumbled for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The scream grew louder, piercing my ears. "Let me out!" I shouted, pounding on the door. Suddenly, everything went silent. The air felt heavier, the darkness pressing against me. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Finally, the door flew open and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stay another night. I checked out the next morning, ignoring the manager's questions and heading straight home. A week later, I was going through my phone when I found a photo I didn't remember taking. It was blurry, but I recognized it immediately. It was room 312, and in the corner of the frame, there she was, staring straight at the camera with hollow, black eyes. Story 4: The Shadows of Griffith Park. I was hiking Griffith Park at sunset when I saw it, the shadow of a man where no man should have been. Griffith Park is one of Los Angeles' most beautiful and popular spots. It's the kind of place people go to escape the chaos of the city, with its winding trails, panoramic views, and a quiet that feels almost unnatural for LA. But the park also has a reputation. Dark stories of cursed land, tragic deaths, and strange occurrences stretch back to its earliest days. I'd heard the tales before, but I didn't think much of them. Until that night. It was late October and the sun was dipping below the hills, casting long shadows over the trail. The air was crisp and I was one of the only people still out, enjoying the solitude. But as I reached a bend in the trail, I felt it, a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I stopped and scanned my surroundings. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting twisting shadows on the ground. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moved, quick, deliberate, and completely out of sync with the others. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the empty trail behind me, stretching into the fading light. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small in the stillness. No answer. Shaking off the unease, I continued walking, but my pace quickened. The peaceful solitude I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. As the sun sank lower, the shadows grew longer, darker. They seemed to stretch across the trail, reaching for me like clawed fingers. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the dirt. Then I saw it again. This time, the shadow darted across the trail ahead of me. It was fast, almost too fast to process, but I was sure of what I'd seen. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't an animal. I stopped, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Still, no answer. I kept walking, but now every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. The trail seemed darker than it should have been, as if the trees were leaning in, blocking out the last traces of sunlight. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I stopped again, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't words exactly, more like a low, murmuring sound, as if someone were speaking just out of earshot. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling now. The whisper stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere ahead, I heard the crunch of footsteps. The trail curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the path, was a figure. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows. His posture was unnatural, rigid, almost too still. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What are you doing out here?" The figure didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, or at least I thought he was staring. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on him, but the beam seemed to pass right through him. It illuminated the trees behind him, but the figure remained dark, his edges blurry and indistinct. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. Still, no response. I don't know what compelled me to move, but I took a step back, and as I did, the figure tilted its head, just slightly, as if it were studying me. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It glided toward me, silent and fast. Panic surged through me and I turned, sprinting back down the trail. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I could hear it behind me, not footsteps exactly, but a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "Help!" I shouted, though I knew no one would hear me. I reached a fork in the trail and took the path to the right, hoping it would lead me back to the parking lot. My legs burned and my lungs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Then the humming stopped. I slowed, glancing over my shoulder. The trail behind me was empty, the shadows still and silent. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. I thought I'd escaped. But then I saw it. The figure was ahead of me now, standing just a few feet away. It had no face, no features, just a void of darkness, where a person should have been. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. The figure loomed over me, its shape shifting and twisting like smoke. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was begging for. The figure leaned closer, and for a moment, I felt a cold breath against my face. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I don't remember how I got back to my car. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I didn't look back. I haven't returned to Griffith Park since that night, but sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can still feel it, the weight of those shadows, the cold breath on my skin, and the sense that somewhere it's still watching me. Story 5. The Curse of Bodie Ghost Town. They say taking anything from Bodie Ghost Town will curse you. I didn't believe it until I brought something back. It was supposed to be a fun road trip. My friends and I had heard about Bodie, a preserved ghost town in California's high desert, and decided to check it out. The stories about the town's curse, how bad luck would follow anyone who took even a pebble from the site, seemed like nothing more than local folklore. But as I stood there, surrounded by decaying wooden buildings and the hollow remains of a once bustling mining town, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bodie was alive. Not in the literal sense, but in the way the air seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. "Come on," Eric said, nudging me. "Let's explore." Bodie was eerily beautiful. The dry desert air had preserved the town almost perfectly, making it feel like the residents had just up and vanished one day. Rusted wagons sat abandoned in the streets, and the windows of old saloons and homes stared back at us like empty eyes. As we wandered through the town, our group split up, each of us eager to take photos and explore on our own. I found myself drawn to a small house at the edge of the settlement. Its roof sagged and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The air inside was stale and dust coated every surface. There wasn't much left, just a broken chair, a table with a cracked top, and a few scattered belongings. But on the windowsill, half hidden beneath layers of grime, was a small object. It was a brass button, tarnished but intact. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was heavy, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore. I slipped it into my pocket, not thinking much of it. When we regrouped, Eric was grinning as he held up a small, rusted horseshoe. "Look what I found," he said. Before anyone could respond, an older man approached us. He must have been part of the park staff. He wore a ranger's uniform and carried himself with the kind of authority that demanded attention. "Put it back," he said sharply, his voice echoing in the still air. Eric frowned. "What?" "Whatever you took," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "Put it back, now." Eric hesitated but eventually placed the horseshoe on the ground. The ranger's gaze swept over us, lingering on me for a moment. "Nothing in this town belongs to you," he said. "Take anything and you'll regret it." I nodded, feeling the weight of the brass button in my pocket, but I didn't say anything. We left Bodie a few hours later, the sun setting behind the desert hills. The drive back was quiet at first, the mood in the car subdued. About an hour in, the car started making strange noises, a grinding sound that grew louder with every mile. "Great," Eric muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. "What now?" He popped the hood, but everything looked fine. Still, the car wouldn't start again. We ended up stranded for hours until a tow truck finally arrived. As we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The desert was vast and empty, but every rustle of the wind through the brush made my skin crawl. When I got home, things only got worse. That night, I dreamed of Bodie. In the dream, I was back in the house where I'd found the button, but it wasn't empty anymore. Shadows flitted through the corners of the room, and I could hear whispers, angry, accusing voices. "You shouldn't have taken it," they hissed. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the unease didn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows again, their shapes twisting and writhing in the darkness. The dreams continued every night, and it wasn't just dreams. Objects in my apartment began to move. My keys wouldn't be where I left them. Lights flickered even when there was no storm, and the feeling of being watched was constant, gnawing at my nerves. A week later, Eric called me. He sounded panicked. "Something's wrong," he said. "We need to talk." We met at a diner, and he told me about the strange things happening at his place. His phone would ring in the middle of the night, but there'd be no one on the line. A shadowy figure had appeared at the foot of his bed one night, vanishing the moment he turned on the light. "I think it's Bodie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That curse, it's real." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew he was right. That night, the activity escalated. I was sitting in my living room when the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in the air and the lights flickered. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from my bedroom. I stood, my heart pounding as I approached the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. When I opened the door, the room was empty, but on the windowsill, where I'd left the brass button, was a message scratched into the wood: "Return it." The next morning, Eric and I drove back to Bodie. Neither of us spoke during the trip, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on us. When we arrived, the town was as quiet and desolate as before, but it didn't feel empty. It felt aware. I went back to the house and placed the button on the windowsill. Eric left his horseshoe near the saloon where he'd found it. As we turned to leave, I felt a sudden rush of warmth, as if the air around me had lightened. For the first time in days, the oppressive feeling was gone. The nightmares stopped after that, and the strange occurrences faded. But I'll never forget the feeling of that curse, how real it was, how it clung to me like a shadow. I haven't been back to Bodie since, and I never will. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some things, they're better left behind.